Hello, and welcome to this episode of The Brief. I'm your host, Meredith Reed. I'm here today with David Ryan Polgar. He is a tech ethicist and digital citizenship expert who has paved the way for hotly debated issues around Facebook, privacy, ethical design, digital well-being, and what it means to be human in the digital age. He's the founder of All Tech is Human, an initiative to better align tech with the human interests of users and society. And he's also the co-host of Funny in Tech, a live show and podcast that tackles the thorniest issues in tech. Welcome, David.
Hey, Meredith, thank you for having me. It's great to talk here. And as you saw in the intro, a lot going on in tech, so we have a lot of area to cover today.
We certainly do. Tech is busier than ever with so many people working remotely for the first time. So just to get started, I always like to let our guests tell our audience in their own words what you do for a living, what you do with your company. So could you just give us an overview of what you're doing with All Tech is Human?
Sure. And then even one step farther back, I think everything that I do in my career is focused on the impact of technology, really how it impacts us from an ethical, legal, emotional perspective, and then how it affects us on an individual level and also a societal level. I have a background personally as an attorney and an educator. And then probably about 2012, really pivoted, if you will, into this full time. And then my life really entails right now running this organization, All Tech is Human, which is based in New York. And we're focused on tech consideration, really getting more people to participate in what we call the politics of technology. Meredith, the way I like to think about it is that your smartphone, right? It affects how you live, love, learn, even die. It affects whether you see a job. It affects how we communicate with our loved ones, especially right now where so many people are working from home. Has a tremendous impact on our human psyche, our human condition. Yet we as individuals have a very limited ability to affect its design and how it's developed and deployed. And I think right now in 2020 and beyond, when we're looking ahead, that's bound to change. All these issues dealing with technology are really societal issues. We like to think that they're just for protect people, and I would strongly disagree with that because its impact is on everybody, no matter where you are and no matter where you are in life. And I think that's so deeply important that it behooves us as a society to think deeply about these issues. And that's kind of what I'm focused on, is trying to increase the thoughtfulness in the technology that we're creating.
And how do you say that this thoughtfulness applies to trust and safety? Obviously at Spectrum Labs, we're working in the trust and safety industry. And I'm interested to see if you could talk a little bit more about how that applies.
Yeah, it dramatically applies to the trust and safety world. That's a world that I have been in for years. I was also recently just appointed to the Content Moderation Council for TikTok. That's going to be thinking about a lot of these trust and safety issues. The reason why it dovetails nicely and it overlaps is that what has happened, if we really step back, is that people have transitioned so much of their livelihood, so much of their communication, so much of the quote unquote public square inside of platforms, right? And really what we have done is we have transitioned from a space, a public, let's say a public square that had hundreds of years of legal jurisprudence, had a lot of thoughtfulness around how we design these spaces, how we allow free expression versus making sure that we have some level of civility, right? So all these issues that we're talking about in trust and safety, like civility and speech and having a vibrant yet safe environment, is everything that we have struggled with for hundreds of years in the actual public square. Right, so I think a lot of times we like to frame these as new issues, but at the same time, what's new about it is the kind of gatekeepers of how we allow this. And I think something I would kind of add to that is crucial for trust and safety is that there's not always a one size fits all agreement about this. One thing I've noticed, and especially with All Tech is Human, where we've been holding ethical tech summits throughout the country last year in San Francisco, Seattle, and New York. One of the things that I personally noticed is that we strongly sometimes disagree about what the right mix is between free expression and toxic behavior. And that is going to be one of the challenges for the trust and safety community, right? Because you are trying to create a safe environment through both AI and human moderation, whereas at the same time, be respectful over, let's say if we're talking about the United States, we're being respectful over our considerations around what we like to think of with our free expression. Becomes doubly complicated by the fact that what we like to refer to with our First Amendment rights in the United States, it doesn't typically apply to companies in the same respect as it would the government, right? If you reread the Constitution, that would kind of make that clear.
That's such an interesting point, and something that I think a lot of us struggle with, where you draw that line between free expression and versus toxic behavior. I'm interested to hear your thoughts, obviously, in this era of COVID-19. It's impossible not to address this and see how what you do for all of this work you do with All Tech is Human, how that applies to this era of COVID. So what have you seen in this era? Can you give an example of free expression versus toxic behavior with regards to what we're currently experiencing as a society?
Oh yeah, definitely. If you're talking specifically in the content moderation, trust and safety space, what COVID-19 has done is it's put enhanced pressure on a lot of companies around curbing misinformation. I think specifically, even if we look at some of the conversations that have happened at Facebook, one of the things that we've noticed as a society is that most of the major platforms have more strongly come down on potential misinformation around COVID-19. And I think one of the reasons why, because sometimes people are like, well, wait a minute, how come that seems to be a different standard than they might do on political speech? And one of the reasons is that political speech is more nuanced in the way in how we consider it, just because it's so vital to our free expression. Whereas if we're talking about something that is more scientific in nature, like COVID-19 and potential misinformation around that, what we've seen is that it's a little easier for platforms to determine what clearly falls outside of the line. In addition, if we're talking about how we weigh the balance of free expression and the potential to, let's say, do harm on an individual or society in general, it's a little easier to make that calculation if we're talking about COVID-19, because truly, if people follow misinformation around treatment or how you deal with symptoms, there's actual death, right? There's significant harm that could happen from this. So I think it's been a little easier from the platform standpoint. One of the struggles, though, that we know from a trust and safety standpoint has been the fact that with COVID-19, we have transitioned so much of our workforce to work from home. But so much of content moderation has also been done in a highly secure manner where you would have to be in an office type setting. So one of the struggles that some of the platforms are having now is how do you extend that to a work from home environment, or can you extend that? Do we need to rely more on AI tools versus content moderation? How do we strike that balance? But the other part that I would love to say, though, with COVID-19 is that what I've kind of seen in my career with All Tech is Human is that it's really caused a major shift in how we think about these digital tools. Obviously, there's been a lot of discussion over the years about this quote unquote techlash. And one of the things that I've noticed is that with COVID-19, we're reframing the argument a little different, because we're seeing the immense value that we have with these digital tools that can connect us and add value to our life. So I think it's really caused a drastic shift in the conversation that we'll see how it plays out over coming weeks and coming months.
Right, exactly. I know we were talking before the call, both for myself and for you, some of these digital platforms that we use more frequently maybe than others. Now we're seeing such an influx of people relying on these platforms to do their work.
Yeah.
So these changes, some of them may be temporary and others may be more far-reaching once we see their impact on how we're able to perform work remotely. So I'm interested to ask you, with major social media platforms like Facebook, what are they doing to keep an eye on what's being said on their platforms, especially now that many of their content moderators have been moved off-site and they may be relying more on AI to perform those tasks?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a rapidly moving issue, but as it seems right now, they seem to have shifted a lot of their work to people who might not traditionally have been right in that content moderation space, more full-time types of employees who would have certain security clearance, if you will, to handle that. Because I think one of the struggles, because a lot of times people think, well, why do you need this mix of human and AI? One of the struggles, though, with anything speech related is that there is significant context that needs to be understood with it. I think a good example to mention is the famous Napalm Girl photo from the Vietnam War. A few years ago, that was a major PR pushback from Facebook's perspective, where what happened was their tool, right, flagged that as child pornography, because by a strict standard, if you look at the Napalm Girl photo that many of us know, it is of a naked underage female running through the street, right? His clothes have been burned off. And when they took that down, right, through their content moderation, through their tool, the pushback was, well, wait a minute. Yes, on one hand, that would normally be deemed inappropriate, but the historical value of this photo is so great that it outweighs what normally would have been deemed inappropriate. So it showcases really how thorny of an issue this is when we're dealing with content moderation, when we're dealing with speech online. And I think that's why, going back to the thoughtfulness, that's why we need to take these issues with a high degree of seriousness, because they're not clear cut, right? We like to say, hey, get rid of misinformation, get rid of hate speech, get rid of inappropriate posts online. But all of those statements are dependent on having a agreed upon definition of what that means, right? We don't agree what is considered toxic sometimes, right? So every platform would be defining their own community standards, and then have their terms of service, and then terms of service linked to what their kind of community guidelines would be, and some of the ramifications for offending it, some of the reporting tools. And again, I think the key part there is that this is a constant work in progress, similar to how we think of free speech in the United States. We're constantly evolving what is considered appropriate or inappropriate. That's why we, have a court system that is constantly refining what some of these words even mean. Even if we think about our Constitution, right? That's an 18th century document that we constantly view differently. I think likewise, we're going to do the same thing around content. We have these guidelines. What we're doing as we change as a society, we'll start making different decisions that seem most appropriate at the time.
Right, absolutely. And of course, it's going to be an evolution over time. So let's jump a little bit to talking about more of internal cultures at some of these tech institutions. You've worked with Ask FM, Twitter, TikTok, plenty of large social platforms to talk about toxicity and how you can create a culture of making trust and safety a priority at these companies. Could you talk a little bit more about what you've done with that?
Sure. Yeah, and just to emphasize, right, my role with Ask FM was in kind of a consultancy capacity, and with TikTok, that's as a advisory board member. And then with Twitter, that was through building out. We had a digital citizenship summit before All Tickets Human. I ran this group, Digital Citizenship Summit, and we held summits throughout the country, and then kind of scaled that globally. In the fall of 2016, we held a large event at Twitter headquarters, really as the kind of push off for U.S. Media Literacy Week. So, Meredith, when you're talking about building this culture inside of companies, I think a lot of what has changed in recent years is understanding the value that a vibrant yet safe environment plays, right? So one of the things that I think has been tricky is that oftentimes with a company or a product, it's very easy for certain expectations of behavior to get baked in. So, for example, if we speak about Twitter, a few months ago, you had their CEO, Jack Dorsey, come out and basically say something to the extent that if he was designing Twitter today, it would be different than when Twitter was launched, right? This idea that kind of coming to terms with how important design is and how subtle cues can really influence long-term behavior, or even just the idea of being able to get followed and follow back, and how that can influence the psychology of how we interact. I think when we're looking at this in 2020, somebody who is designing a platform today is really going to ensure that trust and safety is not deemed as like an afterthought or something that is like a cost to the company, as opposed to a strict benefit, right? Even if you wanted to talk about kind of like an ROI type of perspective, it goes to that in the sense that the safety of the community is so essential now, given how we realize the impact of social media on users' behavior, and then obviously a lot of studies around kind of mental wellness, mental well-being, and its impact with technology. That really then behooves any of these companies to say, wow, if we don't have our trust and safety down pat, nothing else matters, because eventually people will abandon the platform, because they'll view it in a manner that is that it's not a safe place to be. But going to my earlier point, I think what is tricky is setting the vibe for understanding who that community is. So, for example, recently, which I found fascinating, you have Tumblr, which as a platform was dealing with a lot of nudity online. And what was kind of fascinating with that is once they came down hard on saying, listen, no nudity, instead of that decision being kind of embraced by the community, it seemed to almost cause the reverse reaction. I think that's because of the nuanced understanding of nudity and art and certain communities that maybe needed Tumblr as a space to have that type of expression. So my point then is that anytime you're making decisions that are drastically influencing how people communicate on a platform, you can't just think so broadly. You'll have to think specifically about who is this community, right? Who are they made of? What's their kind of ethos? How do they communicate? So I think what we're seeing right now, moving ahead, is that every company is kind of setting a culture, right? Similar to how we think of work culture with ones that maybe were had certain kind of like were problematic kind of workplaces, right? It's like leadership sets a certain tone, and I think the same thing goes with any of these tech companies. So for something like Twitter, you have that company where they would come out and say, kind of we're very kind of libertarian in how we view this, And I think now, as individuals have pushed back to say, yeah, but we do want some level of moderation. That has been a tricky kind of Achilles heel for Twitter to have that massive growth that they would want. I think if we really step back and think about it, that's also because a lot of these founders of these tech companies might have been having a whole different perspective about what they were building. So, for example, if we look at the Cyberspace Manifesto of 1997, which, hey, it sounds like a long time ago, but that was actually very influential on a lot of these founders. That basically, if you read it, that basically says, hey, listen, the online world, these virtual spaces, cyberspace, that's something where laws don't apply, right? Like, you have government over here, and then you have cyberspace over here. Whereas I think what has happened over recent years is we've started to realize that in order to really make this work, we're going to have a greater level of collaboration between the business community or industry, the governmental bodies of oversight, regulation, and the general public to not just be users, but digital citizens that can actively report when there's safety issues, can think of themselves not as alone, but as really kind of a community fabric, and sometimes self-enforce what the etiquette is within that certain community. I think we're realizing that this is a more complex, nuanced issue than what we previously thought.
That's so interesting, and something that I think so many of us have come to realize with the laws in existence with our governments. We haven't really figured out how to apply them to the internet for so many reasons. One of which is who governs, who gets to do that. So, because you're such a visionary with tech and ethics and all of these very deeply important issues, I'd like to ask you as a final question, what you see for the future of tech and ethics, and maybe going off of this regulation issue. What if you had to guess, make an educated guess, 5 years from now, what is that going to look like?
All right. Well, I think 5 years from now, Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act of 1996, that everybody within the industry knows and everybody outside the industry has no idea what we're talking about. That's going to change. I don't think it's going to be. I don't think it's going to go away, but I think it's going to have necessary carve-outs that allow this balance. I think to the general public, to have a law that was written before the founding of Google and well before the social media even existed. I think we're talking years before, obviously, Facebook was founded, right, in a dorm room. So that strikes people as a little odd. We've also seen carve-outs recently of Section 230 dealing with Backpage and sexual exploitation. Obviously, a lot of controversy around those and some of the unintended consequences that you would have with any law. But I think the point is that the joke I always make is that industry has been transferred a significant amount of power. The joke is I don't think they necessarily always want that power, right? And we're struggling. Industry is struggling with, well, how do we deal with that? So basically, what has happened is we went from having a governmental system that would understand, okay, here's what speech is. The legislation would write what the law is, and the judicial body would interpret what that would be. The executive branch would enforce those laws. The general public would have an understanding through the Supreme Court that something is not arbitrary and capricious. The very issues that, frankly, trust and safety have been struggling with, where if the enforcement seems arbitrary and capricious, the people on that platform, they start pushing back. And I think that's where we're going to be different 5 years from now. We're going to have greater collaboration between the industry, governmental bodies, and the general public. We're also going to realize that we need to shift from this finger pointing that we're currently at to realizing that, similar to something like safe driving that has evolved, safe driving depends on me being a savvy individual who's cognizant of other people, who's educated. It considers industry being socially responsible, making safe cars, and it has government thinking about enforcement and also thinking about safe roads. Likewise, trust and safety 5 years from now, it's going to be a lot more natural to say, okay, well, it's this natural symbiotic relationship. It's not just industry, it's not just the user base, it's not just government oversight. We have these necessary guidelines that allow us to understand what the rules are, the parameters and the guardrails. And we have industry that is realizing the significance of what they're doing. And we also have people who are utilizing the platform who don't just think of themselves as alone in front of their phone. They think of this as citizenship, as actually taking a certain level of responsibility and education behind it. And I see a lot of reason for optimism around that. Every day I run into a significant amount of people, or right now talk to a significant amount of people online or through the phone that are inspiring just with how they're trying to create a better tech future, how they realize that digital tools can bring us closer together. But we're just trying to make it work. And the reason is because this is an awesome power. And with great power comes great responsibility. And that's big. And that's where the trust and safety community has a major role to play, and also a role that can be extremely positive in everybody's life.
Absolutely. We've seen, the innovation and change move so quickly, and keeping up with our trust and safety needs for these platforms is just an ongoing challenge, but such an important mission. And I know we are obviously so supportive of the work that you're doing. So thank you so much for being a guest on The Brief. And
well, thank you.
Thank you so much, David, for being here. And thank you for listening. And we'll see you next time on The Brief.